Welcome to True.
American Railroads in 1890, A Comprehensive Historical Account. Introduction. The year 1890 marked a pivotal moment in American railroad history. By this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed for over 2 decades, and the nation's rail network had expanded to unprecedented proportions. The United States possessed over 163,000 miles of railroad track, more than all of Europe combined. Trains had transformed from experimental novelties into the lifeblood of American commerce, connecting bustling cities with remote frontier towns, and carrying everything from passengers to livestock, mail to manufactured goods. This was the golden age of steam locomotion, when coal-burning behemoths thundered across prairies and mountains, when railroad barons wielded enormous power, and when the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails represented progress itself. The 1890s railroad landscape was a complex tapestry of competing lines, elegant passenger services, and an infrastructure that employed hundreds of thousands of workers. This comprehensive account explores the trains, routes, stations, and operations that defined American railroading at this remarkable moment in history. Chapter 1. The Great Locomotives of 1890. Steam Power Dominance. In 1890, steam locomotives reigned supreme across American rails. These magnificent machines represented the cutting edge of industrial technology, with iron and steel construction, intricate valve systems, and the raw power to haul hundreds of tons across thousands of miles. The typical locomotive of this era featured a 440-wheel arrangement, known affectionately as the American type, though larger configurations were increasingly common for heavy freight service. The American-type locomotive had become the standard by 1890, characterized by 4 leading wheels on 2 axles, 4 driving wheels on 2 axles, and no trailing wheels. This design offered excellent stability at speed while maintaining sufficient power for passenger service. These engines typically weighed between 25 and 35 tons, with driving wheels measuring 60 to 70 inches in diameter. The boiler pressure ranged from 130 to 160 pounds per square inch, generating between 800 and 1,200 horsepower. Evolution of locomotive design. By 1890, American locomotive builders had refined their craft considerably. The Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia stood as the nation's premier manufacturer, producing hundreds of engines annually. Their designs incorporated decades of practical experience, with improved boilers that generated steam more efficiently, better suspension systems that protected the machinery from rough track, and enhanced cab designs that offered some protection to engineers and firemen from the elements. The Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works in Paterson, New Jersey, represented another major manufacturer known for elegant passenger locomotives that combined power with aesthetic refinement. Their engines often featured polished brass fittings, elaborate painting schemes, and graceful lines that made them as beautiful as they were functional. The Schenectady Locomotive Works, which would later become part of the American Locomotive Company, also produced high-quality engines for various railroads. Freight locomotives were beginning to diverge from passenger designs by 1890. The 280 consolidation type was gaining popularity for heavy freight service, offering 8 driving wheels that provided superior traction for pulling long trains up grades. These massive engines represented the future of freight railroading, capable of hauling loads that would have required multiple smaller locomotives just a decade earlier. Notable locomotives. Several specific locomotives achieved fame during this era. The New York Central's famous engine 999 would be built just 3 years later in 1893 and would capture the speed record. But in 1890, locomotives like Pennsylvania Railroad's Class D16 were setting standards for passenger service. These 440 engines pulled the finest express trains between New York and Chicago, maintaining speeds of 40 to 50 miles per hour over long distances. The Union Pacific's massive locomotives that had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad continued to serve in 1890, though many were being retired or rebuilt. Engine 119, which had participated in the famous Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit in 1869, was still in service, a living connection to the railroad's heroic construction era. Southern Pacific operated powerful 480 12-wheeler locomotives capable of handling the severe grades over the Sierra Nevada and Tehachapi Mountains. These engines represented the upper limit of steam locomotive technology in 1890, with their 8 driving wheels providing the traction needed for mountain railroading. Chapter 2. Premier Passenger Trains and Services. The limited express services. In 1890, the concept of the named luxury train was well established, and several services had achieved national fame. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Pennsylvania Limited represented the pinnacle of passenger service between New York and Chicago. Inaugurated in 1887, this train featured the finest equipment available, with sleeping cars built by the Pullman Palace Car Company, elegant dining cars where passengers enjoyed 5-course meals on china and crystal, and parlor cars appointed with plush seating and polished wood paneling. The Pennsylvania Limited departed New York's Jersey City terminal at 9:50 a.m., making the journey to Chicago in approximately 24 hours. This represented a significant improvement over earlier services, which had required 30 to 36 hours for the same journey. The train stopped only at major cities like Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Valparaiso, maintaining an average speed of nearly 40 miles per hour, including stops. The New York Central's showcase trains. The New York Central and Hudson River Railroad operated competing luxury services on the more direct water-level route between New York and Chicago. Their premier train, known simply as the Limited, departed Grand Central Depot at 11 a.m. daily, reaching Chicago in a similar 24-hour schedule. The competition between Pennsylvania and New York Central was fierce, with each railroad constantly improving service to attract wealthy passengers willing to pay premium fares. These luxury trains represented far more than mere transportation. They were symbols of American industrial achievement and offered an experience that rivaled the finest hotels. Passengers could enjoy hot meals prepared by skilled chefs in full kitchens, sleep in private compartments with fresh linens, and socialize in observation cars while watching the American landscape roll past at unprecedented speeds. Regional express services. Beyond the premier transcontinental routes, numerous regional express trains provided high-quality service. The Boston and Albany Railroad operated fast trains between Boston and Albany, connecting with New York Central services to the west. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Royal Blue Line provided luxurious service between New York and Washington, with their distinctive blue-painted coaches becoming famous throughout the East Coast. In the South, the Southern Railway System operated express trains connecting Washington, Richmond, Atlanta, and New Orleans. While these services couldn't match the speed of northern routes due to lighter rail and more challenging terrain, they offered comfortable accommodations and steady schedules that had been impossible before the railroad era. The Santa Fe Railway had established itself as the premier route to California by 1890, operating through service from Chicago to Los Angeles via Kansas City, Topeka, Albuquerque, and San Bernardino. The journey required approximately 4 days, but passengers could remain in the same sleeping car for the entire trip, an unprecedented convenience that had been impossible just years earlier. Pullman Palace Cars. No discussion of 1890's passenger service would be complete without examining the Pullman Company's role. George Pullman had revolutionized overnight train travel by introducing sleeping cars that converted from daytime seating to nighttime berths. By 1890, the Pullman Palace Car Company operated thousands of cars on railroads across the nation. A typical Pullman sleeping car featured 12 sections, each with facing seats that converted to lower berths, with upper berths folding down from the ceiling. Heavy curtains provided privacy, and passengers shared washing facilities at each end of the car. More expensive accommodations included private compartments and drawing rooms, which offered genuine privacy and private washing facilities. Pullman also operated dining cars, parlor cars, and observation cars, creating complete trains of luxury equipment that railroads could lease rather than building their own. This system allowed even smaller railroads to offer first-class service, as they could contract with Pullman for equipment and staff, including the famous Pullman porters who attended to passengers' needs. Chapter 3. Major Routes and Cities Connected. The transcontinental routes. By 1890, several transcontinental routes connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The original Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, remained a vital artery. Passengers could board a train in New York, travel via Pennsylvania or New York Central to Chicago, then transfer to the Chicago and Northwestern Railway to Omaha, where the Union Pacific took over for the journey to Ogden, Utah. From Ogden, the Central Pacific, now part of the Southern Pacific System, carried passengers through the Sierra Nevada to Sacramento and San Francisco. The Southern Pacific had completed its own transcontinental route through Texas and New Mexico territory, reaching Los Angeles and San Francisco from New Orleans. This southern route avoided the severe winter weather that could paralyze the northern route, though it passed through harsh desert terrain that presented its own challenges. The Northern Pacific Railway completed its transcontinental line to Seattle and Tacoma in 1883, providing a route through the northern tier of states and territories. This route served growing cities like Minneapolis, Bismarck, Helena, and Spokane, opening vast territories to settlement and commerce. Eastern Corridor, the Boston-Washington axis. The northeastern United States possessed the densest rail network in the nation by 1890. Multiple parallel routes connected Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, with dozens of trains daily on each route. The Pennsylvania Railroad dominated the New York-Washington corridor, operating frequent services that connected these major cities in just a few hours. New York City served as the railroad hub of the nation. Grand Central Depot, rebuilt after a fire in 1881, served the New York Central system and connecting lines. Pennsylvania Railroad passengers crossed the Hudson River by ferry to terminals in Jersey City. As the railroad wouldn't complete its tunnel under the Hudson until 1910, the competing Erie Railroad, Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, and New York, Ontario, and Western railroads all maintained terminals in New Jersey with ferry connections to Manhattan. Philadelphia stood as a major railroad center, with the Pennsylvania Railroad's Broad Street Station serving as headquarters for the entire system. The city's industrial might depended on rail connections that brought coal from Pennsylvania's anthracite fields, raw materials from the interior, and manufactured goods from local factories to markets across the nation. Boston's railroad network radiated in all directions, with the Boston and Maine serving northern New England, the Boston and Albany connecting to New York Central system, and various smaller lines serving the industrial cities of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The Great Lakes Network. Chicago had emerged as the railroad capital of America by 1890. Every major railroad system either originated in Chicago or maintained extensive operations there. The city's position at the southern tip of Lake Michigan made it a natural crossroads between the industrial east and the agricultural west. Dozens of different railroads operated in the Chicago area, with massive yards, terminals, and connecting tracks creating a complex web of iron. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway dominated routes to the northwest, serving Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, and extending to Omaha. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway competed for much of the same territory, offering fast services and modern equipment. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad provided service to the west and southwest, reaching Denver, Omaha, Kansas City, and St. Louis. Detroit had become a major railroad center, with connections to Chicago, Toronto, Buffalo, and other Great Lakes cities. The Michigan Central Railroad operated excellent service to Chicago via Michigan City, while the Grand Trunk Railway connected Detroit to Canada's rail network. Cleveland served as another vital link, with routes connecting to Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Toledo, and beyond. Southern networks. The South's railroad system had largely recovered from the devastation of the Civil War by 1890, though it still lagged behind the North in terms of density and quality. The Southern Railway System formed in 1894, but operating as various component lines in 1890, connected Washington and Richmond to Atlanta, Birmingham, Chattanooga, and New Orleans. Atlanta had emerged as the rail hub of the South, with lines radiating in all directions. The Western and Atlantic Railroad connected to Chattanooga and Nashville. The Georgia Railroad reached Augusta and Charleston. The Atlanta and West Point Railroad provided connections to Montgomery and Mobile. This network made Atlanta the commercial center of the New South, facilitating the region's gradual economic recovery. New Orleans remained a vital port city, with rail connections to the north via the Illinois Central Railroad, to the east via the Louisville and Nashville, and to the west via the Southern Pacific. The city's position as the gateway to Latin American trade made these rail connections crucial for both domestic and international commerce. Western routes and frontier service. West of the Mississippi River, railroads served as lifelines to isolated communities and opened vast territories to settlement. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had completed its route to California via the southern route through Arizona and over Cajon Pass into Los Angeles. The Santa Fe competed directly with the Southern Pacific for traffic between California and the Midwest. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway had established an extensive narrow-gauge network through the Colorado Rockies, serving mining camps and mountain communities. These narrow-gauge lines, with tracks just 3 feet apart rather than the standard 4 feet, 8.5 inches, could navigate tighter curves and steeper grades, making them ideal for mountain railroading despite requiring passengers and freight to transfer at junction points. Kansas City had become a major railroad center, with lines connecting to St. Louis, Chicago, Omaha, Denver, and the Southwest. The Union Pacific, Kansas Pacific, Missouri Pacific, and Santa Fe all maintained significant operations in Kansas City, making it a vital livestock shipping point and commercial center for the Great Plains. Chapter 4. Fuel Sources and Coaling Operations. Coal as the dominant fuel. By 1890, coal had become the nearly universal fuel for American locomotives. The vast coal deposits of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Illinois provided abundant fuel for the nation's railroads. Anthracite coal from northeastern Pennsylvania was particularly prized for passenger locomotives, as it burned with little smoke or odor, creating a more pleasant experience for passengers. Bituminous coal from western Pennsylvania and other regions was more commonly used for freight locomotives, where its greater smoke production was less objectionable. A typical locomotive consumed enormous quantities of coal. A fast passenger train burning anthracite might consume 60 to 80 pounds of coal per mile, meaning a journey from New York to Chicago would require 4 to 5 tons of coal. Freight locomotives working hard grades could consume even more, particularly when hauling heavy trains over mountain passes. Coaling facilities. Every railroad maintained extensive coaling facilities at regular intervals along its routes. A typical coaling station featured a massive elevated structure that stored hundreds of tons of coal. Locomotives would pull alongside these structures, and workers would open chutes that poured coal directly into the tender, the car immediately behind the locomotive that carried fuel and water. The Pennsylvania Railroad operated one of the most sophisticated coaling systems in the nation at its massive Altoona facilities. Here, locomotives that had climbed the eastern slope of the Allegheny Mountains would stop to replenish coal before descending the western slope. The facility could service multiple locomotives simultaneously, with workers carefully monitoring the coal levels to ensure each tender was filled to capacity without overfilling. Western railroads faced unique challenges in obtaining coal. In regions where coal wasn't readily available, railroads sometimes established their own mines or negotiated exclusive contracts with mining companies. The Union Pacific operated coal mines in Wyoming and Utah, ensuring a steady supply for its transcontinental operations. The Santa Fe developed coal resources in New Mexico Territory to fuel its southwestern routes. The coal mining connection. The relationship between railroads and coal mining was symbiotic and complex. Railroads were the largest consumers of coal, but they were also the only practical means of transporting coal from mines to markets. In Pennsylvania's anthracite region, specialized railroads like the Reading Railroad, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western were essentially coal carriers, with coal traffic comprising the majority of their freight tonnage. Mining companies often held significant ownership stakes in railroads, and railroad companies frequently owned coal mines. This vertical integration ensured steady supplies and stable prices, though it also led to accusations of monopolistic practices and sparked regulatory battles that would continue into the 20th century. Wood-burning locomotives. While coal dominated by 1890, some Western railroads still operated wood-burning locomotives, particularly on branch lines and in regions where coal was expensive to import. These engines featured distinctive large spark arresters on their smokestacks to prevent the numerous sparks from wood combustion from starting fires alongside the tracks. Wood burning required frequent fuel stops, as wood has less energy content per pound than coal. A wood-burning locomotive might need to stop every 20 to 30 miles to take on fuel, compared to 80 to 100 miles between coal stops. Railroads employing wood burners maintained wood yards at regular intervals, where workers cut and stacked cordwood in massive piles adjacent to the tracks. The gradual conversion from wood to coal reflected both the depletion of forests near rail lines and the superior economics of coal. A locomotive could travel much farther on a tender of coal than on the same volume of wood, and coal was easier to handle and store. By 1890, the transition to coal was nearly complete on major railroads, with wood burning restricted to the most remote branches. Water supply systems. Steam locomotives required enormous quantities of water as well as fuel. The boiler consumed water continuously, converting it to steam that powered the cylinders. A hard-working locomotive might consume 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of water per hour, necessitating frequent water stops. Every railroad maintained water tanks at regular intervals, typically every 15 to 30 miles on main lines. These tanks, often elevated on wooden or steel towers, became iconic features of the railroad landscape. Locomotives would stop beneath the tank's spout, and firemen would pull down a chain to release water into the tender. In winter, fires burned beneath the tanks to prevent freezing, and workers constantly monitored water levels to ensure adequate supplies. Water quality varied dramatically across the nation, presenting significant challenges for locomotive maintenance. Hard water, common in many western regions, caused scale buildup in boilers that reduced efficiency and could lead to dangerous boiler explosions. Railroads employed various water treatment methods, including adding chemicals to the boiler to prevent scale formation. Some railroads in the arid West transported water hundreds of miles from reliable sources to particularly problematic locations. Chapter 5. Maintenance and Repair Operations. The Roundhouse System. Every significant railroad terminal featured a roundhouse, a semicircular building with a turntable at its center. Locomotives would roll onto the turntable, which would rotate to align them with any of the numerous stalls radiating from the center. Each stall contained inspection pits, tools, and equipment necessary for routine maintenance and minor repairs. Roundhouses bustled with activity around the clock. Skilled mechanics, known as hostlers, would examine locomotives after each trip, checking for worn parts, leaking pipes, loose bolts, and other potential problems. Firemen would clean fireboxes, removing clinkers and ash from the previous trip. Boilermakers would inspect boilers for cracks or weak spots, as boiler explosions represented one of the most serious hazards of steam railroading. The Pennsylvania Railroad's roundhouse at Altoona was among the largest in the nation, capable of servicing dozens of locomotives simultaneously. The facility employed hundreds of workers operating in 3 shifts to ensure that locomotives were always ready for service. Similar massive roundhouses operated in Chicago, where multiple railroads maintained separate facilities, creating a vast complex of repair and maintenance operations. Major repair shops. Beyond routine maintenance performed at roundhouses, railroads operated large shop complexes for heavy repairs and locomotive construction. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works stood as the largest railroad shop in the nation, employing thousands of workers who could completely rebuild locomotives or construct new ones from raw materials. These shops represented self-contained industrial cities. The Altoona Works included foundries for casting iron and brass parts, machine shops with enormous lathes and milling machines for precision work, blacksmith shops where workers forged specialized parts, and erecting shops where locomotives were assembled. The facility could manufacture nearly every component needed for a locomotive, except the most specialized items, like injectors and some valve components. The Burlington shops in Aurora, Illinois, the New York Central shops in Schenectady, and the Southern Pacific shops in Sacramento represented other major repair facilities. These complexes gave railroads independence from locomotive manufacturers for repairs and modifications, allowing them to customize equipment for specific needs and maintain it efficiently. Wheel and axle shops. The constant stress of train operations meant that wheels and axles required regular attention. Specialized shops equipped with massive lathes could true up wheel treads that had developed flat spots from hard braking or slipping. These lathes, among the largest machine tools of their era, could handle driving wheels still mounted on their axles, shaving away tiny amounts of steel to restore a perfect circular profile. Axle inspection was crucial, as a broken axle could cause catastrophic accidents. Railroads had developed sophisticated inspection techniques by 1890, including visual inspection, hammer testing to listen for cracks, and increasingly, primitive forms of X-ray examination. Suspicious axles were removed from service and scrapped, as the consequences of failure were too severe to risk continued use. Boiler inspection and repair. Boiler maintenance represented perhaps the most critical aspect of locomotive servicing. The enormous pressures inside locomotive boilers, typically 130 to 160 pounds per square inch, meant that any weakness could lead to an explosion with devastating consequences. Boilermakers represented an elite class of craftsmen, highly skilled in detecting potential problems and executing repairs. Regular boiler inspections included hydrostatic testing, where the boiler was filled with water and pressurized beyond normal operating pressure to reveal any weak spots. Boilermakers would tap every square foot of the boiler with small hammers, listening for the sound changes that indicated thinning metal. Suspect areas would be drilled to measure remaining thickness, and if the metal had thinned beyond safe limits, patches would be riveted over the weak spots. Boiler washing occurred at regular intervals, typically every 30 to 60 days. Workers would enter the firebox and boiler barrel through access ports, manually cleaning away scale deposits that reduced heat transfer efficiency. This hot, cramped, dangerous work was essential for maintaining locomotive performance and preventing dangerous buildup that could lead to boiler failure. Track maintenance operations. While not directly related to locomotive repair, track maintenance was essential for safe railroad operations. Railroads employed large gangs of sectionmen who walked the tracks daily, looking for broken rails, loose spikes, or other defects. These workers, often recent immigrants, performed the backbreaking labor of replacing ties, adjusting rail alignment, and maintaining proper drainage. By 1890, most major railroads had adopted steel rails to replace the iron rails of earlier decades. Steel rails lasted much longer and could support heavier trains, but they still required constant attention. Rail joints, where individual rails met, represented particular weak points, as the continuous pounding of train wheels gradually loosened the connection plates and spikes. Some railroads had begun using small locomotives pulling flat cars loaded with new ties, rails, and ballast to speed track maintenance. These work trains could quickly reach problem areas and deliver materials, allowing maintenance crews to work more efficiently. The most progressive railroads were experimenting with specialized track equipment, including mechanical spike drivers and rail benders, though most work still relied on manual labor and simple hand tools. Chapter 6. Famous Railway Stations of the Era. Grand Central Depot, New York. Grand Central Depot stood as one of the most impressive railroad stations in America in 1890. Built in 1871 and rebuilt after a fire in 1881, the station served the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, the New York and Harlem Railroad, and the New York and New Haven Railroad. The building featured a massive train shed with 3 enormous arched spans covering 32 tracks, allowing multiple trains to arrive and depart simultaneously. The depot's facade on 42nd Street presented an impressive sight with its Second Empire architectural style, mansard roof, and 3 towers. Inside, the main waiting room could accommodate thousands of passengers, with marble floors, high ceilings, and large windows providing natural light. Ticket offices lined the walls, with agents selling tickets to destinations across the nation. The depot was constantly busy, with suburban trains serving communities along the Hudson River and in Westchester County arriving and departing every few minutes during peak periods. Long-distance trains to Chicago, Buffalo, Montreal, and other cities added to the activity. The depot represented the New York Central's pride and its position as one of America's premier railroads. Pennsylvania Station, Philadelphia. Broad Street Station. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Broad Street Station in Philadelphia represented the railroad's power and wealth. Built in 1881 to 1882, the station featured a distinctive Victorian Gothic design, with a massive clock tower visible for miles. The building occupied an entire city block and served as both a passenger terminal and the administrative headquarters for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Inside, a grand waiting room featured high vaulted ceilings, elaborate chandeliers, and marble columns. Separate waiting rooms served first-class passengers and women traveling alone, reflecting the social customs of the era. The train shed, built of iron and glass, covered 16 tracks and extended for several hundred feet, protecting passengers from the elements while they boarded or alighted from trains. Broad Street Station saw continuous traffic throughout the day and night. Suburban trains served communities along the main line and other Pennsylvania Railroad branches. Long-distance trains departed for New York, Washington, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. The railroad employed hundreds of workers at the station, including ticket agents, baggage handlers, cleaners, and dispatchers who coordinated the complex movements of trains through the facility. Union Depot, Chicago. Chicago's Union Depot opened in 1881, served multiple railroads, including the Chicago and Alton, the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railway, a Pennsylvania Railroad subsidiary, and several smaller lines. The station's location on the west bank of the Chicago River made it convenient to downtown business districts, though passengers often had to transfer to different stations to reach trains on other railroads. The depot featured a waiting room measuring 145 by 70 feet, with a ceiling 50 feet high. Large windows provided natural light, and gas fixtures illuminated the space after dark. Separate waiting rooms for men and women, as well as first-class and immigrant passengers, reflected the social segregation common in the era. The train shed covered 8 tracks and measured 525 feet long, providing ample space for simultaneous train operations. Chicago's status as the nation's railroad hub meant that the city operated multiple major stations, each serving different railroads. Dearborn Station, LaSalle Street Station, Central Station, and several others competed with Union Depot, creating confusion for passengers who often had to cross the city to make connections between different railroads. This inefficiency would eventually lead to calls for Union stations that could serve multiple railroads, though such facilities wouldn't be common until the 20th century. At Union Station, St. Louis. St. Louis Union Station, completed in 1894, but begun in the late 1880s, would become one of the most magnificent railroad stations in America. In 1890, St. Louis was served by older, smaller stations, but plans for the Grand Union Station were already underway. The city's position as a gateway to the west made it a crucial railroad center, with trains connecting to Chicago, Kansas City, New Orleans, and beyond. The older stations serving St. Louis in 1890 reflected the city's importance, but lacked the grandeur of stations in New York or Philadelphia. Multiple railroads operated separate facilities, creating the same connection problems that plagued Chicago. Passengers transferring between lines had to arrange transportation across the city, often with their baggage, creating delays and inconvenience. Despite these limitations, St. Louis's railroad facilities handled enormous traffic volumes. Freight trains carrying manufactured goods from St. Louis factories departed for destinations across the nation. Passenger trains connected St. Louis's substantial German immigrant community to family members in the east and provided service to growing western cities. The Mississippi River Bridge, completed in 1874, allowed trains to cross directly into St. Louis, eliminating the ferry transfers that had been necessary in earlier years. South Station, Boston. Boston's South Station wouldn't be completed until 1899, but in 1890, Boston operated several major stations that handled the city's substantial railroad traffic. The Boston and Albany Railroad operated a station in downtown Boston, while the Old Colony Railroad maintained its own terminal. The Boston and Maine Railroad served the North Shore and northern New England from separate facilities. These older stations, while functional, were becoming increasingly inadequate for Boston's growing railroad traffic. Platforms were often exposed to the elements, forcing passengers to endure rain, snow, and cold while waiting for trains. Waiting rooms were cramped and poorly lit. The separation of different railroads' facilities made connections difficult and time-consuming. Despite these limitations, Boston's stations served the city well throughout the 1890s. Suburban trains carried workers from bedroom communities to downtown offices, returning them home in the evening. Long-distance trains connected Boston to New York, Albany, Montreal, and other cities. Freight trains carried the products of New England's mills and factories to markets across the nation, returning with raw materials and goods from other regions. Dearborn Station, Chicago, Dearborn Station, completed in 1885, served the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad, and several other lines. The station's distinctive Romanesque Revival architecture, with its red brick construction and prominent clock tower, made it one of Chicago's most recognizable landmarks. The building featured a waiting room with a 50-foot ceiling, marble floors, and elaborate woodwork. The station's location on Dearborn Street, south of downtown, provided good access to the city center while avoiding the congestion of the immediate downtown area. The train shed covered 10 tracks and measured 700 feet long, providing ample space for train operations. The station handled both long-distance and suburban traffic, with Santa Fe trains departing for Kansas City, Denver, and California alongside suburban trains serving Chicago's growing South Side communities. Dearborn Station represented the prosperity and confidence of the railroads in the 1890s. The substantial investment in such an impressive facility demonstrated the Santa Fe's commitment to Chicago traffic and its competition with other railroads serving the city. The station would serve Chicago for decades, becoming an integral part of the city's transportation infrastructure and architectural heritage. Washington Union Station. While the famous Washington Union Station wouldn't be completed until 1907, in 1890, Washington was served by several railroad stations, including the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, completed in 1873. This station, located on the National Mall where the National Gallery of Art now stands, served both the B and P Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which acquired control of the B and P in 1883. The Baltimore and Potomac Station featured Victorian Gothic architecture with a prominent tower and ornate brickwork. Inside, waiting rooms served both first-class and general passengers, with separate facilities for different classes reflecting social distinctions of the era. The station handled substantial traffic, including many government officials traveling between Washington and other East Coast cities. The station's location on the National Mall would later be considered inappropriate, and the building gained unfortunate fame as the site of President James Garfield's shooting in 1881. Despite this tragedy, the station continued to serve Washington throughout the 1890s, handling increasing traffic as the city grew and the federal government expanded. Plans for a Grand Union Station to replace the various separate railroad stations in Washington were already being discussed, though implementation would take another decade and a half. Chapter 7: Train Operations and Scheduling. The Timetable System. Railroad operations in 1890 relied entirely on published timetables and the skill of train crews in following them precisely. Each railroad published detailed timetables specifying exactly when each train should pass every station and junction point along its route. These timetables were complex documents, often dozens of pages long, listing hundreds of trains and their scheduled times at every stop. Operating employees carried their railroad's timetable at all times and were required to know the schedules for all trains on their division. Passenger train schedules were also published in newspapers and in public timetables available at stations, but employee timetables included additional information about freight train schedules, track maintenance operations, and operating rules. Timetables divided the day into two 12-hour periods, with times before noon designated by AM and times after noon by PM. This system could create confusion, as a train scheduled at 12:01 AM ran just after midnight, while 12:01 PM meant just after noon. Despite potential confusion, the system worked remarkably well, with thousands of trains operating safely using only timetables and visual signals. Telegraph communication. The telegraph was essential for railroad operations in 1890. Every station, even tiny ones serving small communities, had a telegraph office where operators sent and received messages continuously. Train dispatchers used the telegraph to communicate with station agents, issuing orders that modified regular timetable operations when necessary. When a train ran late, the dispatcher would telegraph ahead to stations where opposing trains might be waiting, issuing train orders that authorized one train to proceed while holding the other. These orders had to be copied exactly by the receiving operator, who would then repeat the order back to the dispatcher to confirm accuracy. Any error in copying or transmitting could lead to catastrophic collisions. The most common type of train order in 1890 was the meet order, specifying where two trains traveling in opposite directions on single-track railroad would pass each other. The dispatcher might order eastbound train 5 to take the siding at station X and wait for westbound train 4 to pass. Both trains would receive copies of the same order, ensuring that both crews understood which train had the right to the main track. Signal systems. While many railroads still relied primarily on timetable and train order operations in 1890, signal systems were becoming increasingly common, particularly around major terminals and on heavily trafficked routes. The most common signals were semaphore arms, mounted on tall masts beside the track. A horizontal arm indicated stop, an arm at 45 degrees meant caution, and an arm pointing straight down signaled proceed. Some railroads had begun installing interlocking plants at complex junctions and terminals. These systems mechanically connected switches and signals so that it was impossible to display a proceed signal unless all switches were properly aligned for that route. A tower operator controlled the interlocking by pulling levers that moved both switches and signals, with the mechanical interlocking ensuring that conflicting routes couldn't be set simultaneously. The Pennsylvania Railroad led in signal system development, installing extensive interlocking plants and automatic block signals on its busiest routes. Automatic block signals used electrical track circuits that detected the presence of trains, displaying stop signals behind occupied track sections. This system provided an additional layer of safety beyond timetable operations, preventing following trains from overtaking trains ahead. Train crew organization. A typical passenger train in 1890 required a substantial crew. The locomotive crew consisted of the engineer, who operated the engine, and the fireman, who maintained steam pressure by shoveling coal into the firebox and managing water supplies. These men worked in close coordination, with the fireman also serving as the engineer's assistant and lookout. The train crew, distinct from the locomotive crew, included a conductor who had overall responsibility for the train, and one or more brakemen who coupled and uncoupled cars, operated handbrakes, and assisted passengers. On passenger trains, additional crew members might include a baggage man who handled luggage and express packages, a mail clerk who sorted mail in dedicated mail cars, and Pullman porters who served sleeping car passengers. Passenger train crews wore distinctive uniforms that identified their positions and railroad. Conductors typically wore formal dark suits, with caps bearing their railroad's insignia, carrying watches and punch devices for validating tickets. Engineers and firemen wore work clothes suitable for the hot, dirty conditions in locomotive cabs, though they took pride in their appearance and kept their engines as clean as possible. Freight train crews were organized similarly, but worked under more difficult conditions. Freight trains ran on less predictable schedules, often waiting in sidings for hours to allow passenger trains to pass. Brakemen on freight trains performed dangerous work, climbing atop moving cars to reach handbrakes, especially before air brakes became universal on freight cars. Many brakemen lost fingers or hands to coupling operations, and falls from moving cars claimed numerous lives every year. Passenger ticketing and classes. Railroad ticketing in 1890 remained relatively simple compared to later eras. Passengers purchased tickets at station ticket windows, specifying their destination and desired class of service. First-class tickets entitled passengers to seats in the finest coaches, often including reclining seats with plush upholstery. Second-class tickets provided basic seating in simpler coaches, often older equipment that had been downgraded from first-class service. Sleeping car accommodations required separate charges beyond the basic ticket price. Passengers paid the railroad for transportation and paid the Pullman company directly for sleeping car berths. A typical lower berth from New York to Chicago might cost $3 to $4, in addition to the railroad ticket price of perhaps $20 for first-class service. Upper berths cost slightly less, as they were considered less desirable. Special tickets included excursion fares for groups, clergy tickets sold at reduced rates to ordained ministers, and passes issued to railroad employees and their families. Railroad officials also issued passes to politicians, businessmen, and other influential individuals as a form of political influence, a practice that would later be outlawed but was common in 1890. Freight operations. Freight trains represented the economic backbone of railroad operations, though they received far less public attention than glamorous passenger services. A typical freight train in 1890 consisted of 20 to 40 cars, hauling a mix of manufactured goods, raw materials, livestock, and agricultural products. These trains operated on flexible schedules, often waiting in sidings for hours to allow passenger trains priority on single-track routes. Freight cars came in numerous specialized designs by 1890. Boxcars with sliding doors on their sides carried general merchandise and goods requiring weather protection. Flat cars transported lumber, machinery, and other loads that could withstand exposure to the elements. Gondola cars with open tops and sides carried coal, ore, and other bulk commodities. Refrigerator cars, insulated and cooled with ice, transported fresh meat and produce across long distances, revolutionizing the food industry. Livestock cars with slatted sides for ventilation carried cattle, hogs, and sheep to major markets. The Union Stock Yards in Chicago represented the largest livestock market in the world, with trains arriving daily from ranches and farms across the Great Plains and Midwest. Railroad companies maintained special stock yards at many stations where the animals could be unloaded, fed, and watered during long journeys, as federal law required such rest periods. Classification yards. Major railroad terminals included classification yards, where freight cars were sorted by destination. Arriving freight trains would be pulled into the yard and uncoupled. Switch engines would then move individual cars, or groups of cars, to different tracks based on their destinations. Cars bound for the same city, or railroad, would be grouped together to form new trains. This process could take hours or even days, as a single freight car might be switched multiple times before being incorporated into an outbound train heading in the right direction. The Pennsylvania Railroad's yards at Altoona handled thousands of cars daily, with switch engines constantly moving back and forth, assembling and disassembling trains. Some progressive railroads had begun building hump yards by 1890, though they remained uncommon. In a hump yard, cars were pushed up a slight hill, then uncoupled, and allowed to roll down the other side by gravity. Switch operators would align track switches to direct each car to its proper classification track. This system increased efficiency significantly, though it required careful design and precise execution to prevent cars from rolling too fast and causing damage. Chapter 8. Safety Systems and Accidents. The Air Brake Revolution. One of the most significant safety improvements of the era was the air brake, invented by George Westinghouse in 1869, and gradually adopted throughout the 1870s and 1880s. By 1890, virtually all passenger trains used air brakes, which allowed the engineer to control brakes on every car from the locomotive cab. This revolutionary system dramatically improved safety and allowed trains to operate at higher speeds. Before air brakes, each car had handbrakes that had to be set individually by brakemen. When an engineer needed to stop a train, he would whistle a signal, and brakemen would scramble along the tops of moving cars, turning brake wheels to set the brakes. This system was slow, dangerous, and ineffective, particularly with long trains or on steep grades. The air brake system changed everything. The air brake worked through a continuous pipe running the length of the train. Air pressure from the locomotive kept the brakes released on all cars. When the engineer moved his brake valve, he reduced air pressure in the pipe, which caused brakes on every car to apply automatically. This system had a crucial safety feature. If the train separated accidentally, the loss of air pressure would automatically apply the brakes on all cars, preventing runaways. Despite the obvious advantages of air brakes, freight trains in 1890 still commonly used hand brakes. The cost of equipping thousands of freight cars with air brakes and the need to maintain the systems proved expensive for railroads focused on minimizing costs. This created dangerous situations when passenger trains with air brakes shared tracks with freight trains still using hand brakes. The problem wouldn't be fully resolved until federal law mandated air brakes on all trains in 1893. Automatic couplers. The link and pin coupler system, used on most freight cars in 1890, represented one of the railroad industry's most dangerous aspects. Coupling two cars required a brakeman to stand between them, holding a heavy link that had to be dropped into place just as the cars came together, then inserting a pin to secure the link. This operation crushed thousands of fingers and hands annually, and miscalculations could result in death. Several inventors had developed automatic coupler designs that allowed cars to couple simply by pushing them together, but railroads resisted adoption due to the enormous cost of re-equipping their entire fleets. Some railroads had begun installing automatic couplers on new equipment by 1890, but the industry-wide change wouldn't occur until the Safety Appliance Act of 1893 mandated automatic couplers on all railroad cars. The Pennsylvania Railroad led in adopting automatic couplers, installing them on new freight cars throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s. The railroad's management recognized both the humanitarian benefit of reducing injuries and the economic advantage of faster, easier coupling operations. However, the mixing of automatic and link and pin couplers created its own problems, as transition cars with both types of couplers were needed at interchange points. Accidents and their causes. Despite improving safety systems, railroad accidents remained common in 1890. Collisions between trains accounted for many accidents, usually resulting from miscommunication, misunderstood train orders, or failure to follow timetable instructions. A train crew might misread an order and proceed into the path of another train, or a dispatcher might issue conflicting orders to two trains, or an operator might copy an order incorrectly. Derailments represented another major category of accidents. Track defects, including broken rails and spread rails, caused many derailments. Excessive speed on curves could cause trains to tip over, particularly with the relatively primitive suspension systems of the era. Washouts during heavy rains could undermine track support, causing rails to collapse under the weight of passing trains. Boiler explosions, while less common than collisions or derailments, were particularly devastating when they occurred. The enormous energy released when a boiler failed could destroy the locomotive entirely and kill everyone nearby. Most boiler explosions resulted from low water levels, exposing hot metal to sudden contact with water when the locomotive crossed an uneven section of track, creating a massive steam explosion. Bridge failures caused some of the era's most catastrophic accidents. The collapse of the Ashtabula Bridge in Ohio in 1876 killed 92 people when a passenger train plunged into the icy river below. This disaster and others led to more rigorous bridge inspection standards and better design practices, but bridges remained potential weak points in the railroad system, particularly during floods or severe weather. Reporting and investigation. By 1890, railroads were required to report serious accidents to state railroad commissions or other regulatory bodies, though federal regulation remained limited. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established in 1887, was beginning to compile accident statistics and investigate major accidents involving interstate trains, but its powers remained limited compared to later eras. Accident investigations typically focused on assigning blame rather than systematically analyzing causes to prevent future accidents. Railroad companies often blamed crew members for accidents, sometimes fairly, but other times to deflect responsibility from inadequate systems or equipment. Labor unions fought for fair treatment of employees and called for improved safety equipment and better working conditions. The press covered major railroad accidents extensively, sometimes sensationalizing disasters, but also drawing public attention to safety issues. Graphic descriptions of accidents helped build support for safety regulations, including the mandatory adoption of air brakes and automatic couplers that would be mandated in the 1893 Safety Appliance Act. Chapter 9. The Economics of Railroad Operations. Rate Structure and Competition. Railroad rates, in 1890, reflected a complex mix of competition, regulation, and what the traffic would bear. On routes served by multiple railroads, competition could be fierce, with railroads cutting rates to attract business. Between Chicago and New York, the Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central, Erie Railroad, and Baltimore and Ohio competed intensely, sometimes engaging in rate wars that drove prices below the cost of service. Conversely, railroads held monopoly positions in many areas, particularly in the West, where a single line might serve a vast territory. In these markets, railroads charged whatever rates they believed shippers could afford, a practice known as charging what the traffic will bear. Agricultural shippers particularly resented this practice, as they depended on railroads to get their crops to market and had no alternative transportation options. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 had begun federal regulation of railroad rates, prohibiting some of the most egregious practices, including charging more for short hauls than long hauls on the same line. However, the Interstate Commerce Commission's powers remained limited in 1890, and railroads successfully evaded many regulations through creative access, accounting, and legal challenges, capital investment, and financing. Railroads represented the largest business enterprises in America in 1890, requiring enormous capital investments in locomotives, cars, track, stations, and other facilities. The Pennsylvania Railroad's market capitalization exceeded that of any other corporation in the nation. The New York Central, Union Pacific, and other major systems also represented investments running into hundreds of millions of dollars. Railroad securities, particularly bonds, represented major investments for both American and European investors. British investors held substantial stakes in many American railroads, seeking the higher returns available in the American market compared to more mature European railways. This foreign investment provided crucial capital for railroad expansion, but also created concerns about foreign control of vital American infrastructure. Railroad finance in 1890 included both legitimate investment and considerable speculation and fraud. Some railroad promoters built lines primarily to profit from construction contracts rather than create viable operating properties. The practice of watering stock, issuing shares worth far more than the actual value of railroad assets, enriched insiders while burdening railroads with excessive capitalization that required high rates to generate adequate returns. Operating costs and efficiency. Railroad operating expenses in 1890 were dominated by labor costs. Railroads employed hundreds of thousands of workers, from highly skilled locomotive engineers and telegraphers to section hands who maintained track with hand tools. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone employed over 110,000 workers, making it one of the nation's largest employers. Fuel costs represented another major expense. Coal purchases consumed substantial portions of operating budgets, particularly for railroads operating in regions distant from coal fields. Some railroads achieved economies by owning their own coal mines, ensuring steady supplies at known costs. Others negotiated long-term contracts with mining companies, trading price certainty for potentially lower spot market prices. Maintenance costs for locomotives, cars, and track represented a constant drain on railroad finances. The harsh operating conditions and primitive metallurgy of the era meant that components wore out quickly. Rails had to be replaced regularly, particularly on main lines carrying heavy traffic. Locomotives required constant attention, with major overhauls needed every few years to replace worn parts and maintain safe operations. Passenger versus freight profitability. Passenger service generally provided lower profit margins than freight service, particularly in competitive markets where railroads maintained prestigious named trains with luxury equipment and frequent schedules. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Pennsylvania Limited and similar trains generated good revenues, but required expensive equipment and crews, reducing profit margins. Freight traffic provided the bulk of railroad profits, particularly for western roads hauling bulk commodities like grain, lumber, and minerals. These shipments moved in trainload quantities, required no passenger amenities, and could be scheduled flexibly to maximize efficiency. The Pennsylvania Railroad's enormous freight traffic, particularly coal from Pennsylvania fields to eastern cities, and manufactured goods moving in both directions, generated reliable profits that supported the entire system. Some passenger services lost money but were maintained for competitive reasons or legal obligations. States often mandated that railroads maintain service to communities along their routes, even if passenger traffic didn't justify the expense. Railroads cross-subsidized these losing services with profits from freight operations and profitable passenger routes. Chapter 10. Labor and Working Conditions. Railroad Brotherhoods and Labor Organization. By 1890, railroad workers had established several powerful labor organizations known as brotherhoods. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, founded in 1863, represented skilled engineers and held considerable bargaining power, as railroads couldn't operate without qualified engineers. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, the Order of Railway Conductors, and the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen represented other operating employees. These organizations functioned partly as labor unions and partly as fraternal societies, providing death benefits and insurance to members' families. Railroad work was dangerous, and the brotherhoods played crucial roles in supporting widows and orphans of members killed in accidents. They also negotiated work rules and pay scales with railroads, though they generally avoided strikes, viewing themselves as skilled professionals rather than traditional industrial workers. Other railroad workers, including section hands, shop workers, and station employees, lacked strong organization in 1890. These workers, often immigrants working for low wages, had little bargaining power and endured difficult conditions. Railroad companies actively opposed unionization of these workers, fearing that successful organization would increase labor costs and reduce management flexibility. Working hours and conditions. Railroad operating employees worked extremely long hours in 1890. Engineers and firemen might work 12 to 16 hours continuously on long freight runs, with only brief breaks at division points. Telegraph operators worked similar shifts, maintaining constant vigilance to copy train orders accurately despite fatigue. Section hands worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining track, with only Sundays off. The work was not only long, but also dangerous. Engineers and firemen worked in cramped, hot, dirty locomotive cabs, exposed to weather and the constant danger of accidents. Brakemen climbing atop moving cars to set handbrakes faced risks of falls and being swept off by low bridges. Section hands working on active tracks could be struck by passing trains if they failed to clear the track quickly enough when trains approached. Shop workers operated dangerous machinery with few safety guards, resulting in frequent injuries from flying metal chips, burns from molten metal in foundries, and crushing injuries from heavy equipment. The absence of workers' compensation laws meant that injured workers and their families often faced financial disaster, as railroad companies generally avoided responsibility for workplace injuries. Wages and economic security. Railroad wages in 1890 varied dramatically based on skill level and position. Locomotive engineers earned relatively high wages, perhaps $150 to $200 monthly, reflecting their crucial responsibilities and years of experience required to reach that position. Conductors earned similar amounts. Firemen and brakemen earned considerably less, perhaps $50 to $75 monthly, as these positions required less skill and often served as stepping stones to higher positions. Section hands and other unskilled workers earned very low wages, often less than $1.50 per day. These workers, frequently recent immigrants, lived in poverty despite working long hours in difficult conditions. Railroad companies provided housing to section workers in some areas, though these accommodations were often primitive and overcrowded. Railroad employment provided some economic security despite the dangers and difficult conditions. Railroads generally operated continuously, providing steady work, unlike many industries that experienced seasonal layoffs. The possibility of advancement from fireman to engineer, or from brakeman to conductor, offered opportunities for improving one's economic position through hard work and skill development. Strikes and labor conflict. The 1890s would see increasing labor conflict on American railroads. Though 1890 itself was relatively peaceful, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 remained a vivid memory, demonstrating both labor's power to shut down transportation and management's willingness to use force to break strikes. State militias and federal troops had suppressed that strike violently, setting patterns that would repeat in later conflicts. Railroad companies in 1890 maintained blacklists of workers involved in union activities, sharing information to prevent these workers from finding employment on any railroad. Companies also hired private detective agencies, particularly the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, to infiltrate labor organizations and identify leaders. These practices created deep antagonism between labor and management that would explode in conflicts, including the Pullman Strike of 1894. Despite these tensions, many railroad workers took pride in their work and felt loyalty to their employers. Skilled workers particularly viewed themselves as professionals whose expertise made them valuable and difficult to replace. This attitude sometimes created divisions between skilled workers in the brotherhoods and unskilled workers seeking to organize, complicating labor's collective action efforts. Chapter 11. Railroad Impact on Society and Economy. Transformation of American Life. The railroad's impact on American society by 1890 can hardly be overstated. Railroads had made possible the settlement of the West, the industrialization of the North, and the integration of regional economies into a national market. Cities grew along railroad lines, while communities bypassed by railroads stagnated or died. The railroad determined where Americans lived, worked, and traveled. Fresh food transportation by refrigerator car revolutionized American diets. City dwellers could purchase fresh meat from Chicago packing houses and fresh produce from California, foods that would have been unavailable or prohibitively expensive without rail transport. This dietary transformation improved nutrition and health, particularly for urban populations previously dependent on preserved foods and local production. The railroad also transformed American concepts of time and space. Before railroads, journey times varied based on weather, road conditions, and other unpredictable factors. Railroads operated on published schedules, making travel time predictable and allowing people to plan their activities with precision. The need for consistent scheduling across long distances led to the adoption of standardized time zones in 1883, replacing the previous system where each city kept its own local time. Economic integration and development. Railroads created a truly national economy by 1890, allowing goods produced anywhere to reach consumers everywhere. A farmer in Kansas could ship wheat to mills in Minneapolis, which produced flour that was shipped to bakeries in Boston. A factory in Pittsburgh could manufacture steel beams that were shipped to San Francisco for building construction. This economic integration allowed regions to specialize in activities for which they held comparative advantages. The railroad industry itself represented a massive consumer of manufactured goods, driving industrial development across many sectors. Locomotive and car construction employed tens of thousands of workers. Rail mills produced thousands of tons of steel rails annually. Coal mining expanded dramatically to supply locomotive fuel. Lumber companies supplied wood for ties and car construction. These industries grew alongside railroads in a mutually reinforcing relationship. Railroad investment attracted massive capital flows, particularly from Europe, providing crucial financing for American economic development. British investors particularly viewed American railroad securities as attractive investments, offering higher returns than available in Britain. This foreign capital helped finance the rapid expansion of the American rail network, though it also created dependencies that would cause problems during economic downturns. Town and city development. The railroad's influence on town and city development shaped the American landscape. Towns that secured railroad service often thrived, while those bypassed withered. Town founders often negotiated with railroad companies, offering land grants and other inducements to secure a station. Some towns were created entirely by railroad companies, laid out with streets aligned to the railroad and lots sold to settlers. Railroad stations became focal points of town life. The arrival of trains, particularly passenger trains, drew crowds who came to meet arriving visitors, send off departing residents, or simply socialize. Station agents often served as informal town leaders, as they controlled telegraph communication with the outside world and represented the railroad company's authority. Major cities competed intensely for railroad connections, recognizing that rail service determined commercial success. Chicago's rise to become the nation's second-largest city resulted largely from its position as the railroad hub connecting east and west. Kansas City's growth stemmed from its location at the convergence of multiple railroad routes. Cities that failed to secure good railroad connections, regardless of their other advantages, struggled to compete. Cultural and social impact. Railroads facilitated cultural exchange and social mobility in unprecedented ways. People could travel to distant cities to visit family, attend college, or seek better opportunities. This mobility weakened traditional social structures based on stable, localized communities, contributing to the development of a more fluid, individualistic American society. The railroad also influenced American popular culture. Railroad workers, particularly engineers and conductors, became folk heroes, celebrated in songs and stories for their skill and bravery. Famous train wrecks and robberies captured public imagination, inspiring countless newspaper articles and dime novels. The Casey Jones legend, based on a real 1900 train crash, would exemplify how railroading entered American mythology. Railroad travel itself became an important cultural experience. Wealthy Americans could travel in Pullman luxury, enjoying fine meals and comfortable sleeping accommodations while watching the American landscape unfold outside their windows. Even ordinary travelers experienced a sense of adventure and progress, as steam locomotives carried them across distances that would have required days or weeks of difficult stagecoach travel just decades earlier. Conclusion: the railroad at its peak. The year 1890 represented the American railroad at a moment of triumph and transformation. The basic network was largely complete, connecting all major cities and extending into most regions. Technology had advanced significantly, with powerful locomotives, comfortable passenger cars, and improving safety systems. The railroad dominated American transportation, facing no serious competition for moving passengers or freight over any significant distance. Yet challenges loomed. The industry's consolidation into large systems controlled by powerful financiers concerned many Americans who feared monopolistic power over transportation. Labor unrest was building as workers organized to demand better wages and working conditions. The costs of construction had burdened many railroads with excessive debt, making them vulnerable to economic downturns. The Panic of 1893 would soon demonstrate these vulnerabilities, leading to numerous railroad bankruptcies and reorganizations. The railroad's technological momentum continued into the 1890s and beyond. Locomotives grew larger and more powerful. Passenger accommodations became more luxurious. Safety systems improved. But the railroad's dominance would eventually face challenges from new technologies. The automobile remained a curiosity in 1890, but within a few decades, it would begin eroding the railroad's passenger business. Trucks would eventually challenge freight dominance as well, though that competition remained far in the future. In 1890, however, the railroad stood unchallenged. The haunting whistle of steam locomotives echoed across prairies and mountains, through cities and small towns, announcing the arrival of modernity. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails provided the soundtrack of American progress, from the luxurious drawing rooms of transcontinental limiteds to the crude cabooses of local freight trains, from the grand terminals of major cities to tiny flag stops on remote branch lines. The railroad connected Americans to each other and to the promise of an industrializing nation. The railroad workers of 1890, from company presidents in paneled offices to section hands swinging sledgehammers in the sun, built and operated a system that transformed America. Their achievements, purchased with hard work, ingenuity, and often tragedy, created the infrastructure that made modern America possible. The trains of 1890, with their steam and smoke, their polished brass and painted panels, their power and speed, represented the cutting edge of human technological achievement and the foundation of American economic prosperity. This was the American Railroad in 1890, a vast, complex system that moved millions of passengers and countless tons of freight, that employed hundreds of thousands of workers, that represented billions of dollars in investment, and that stood as testimony to American industrial might and organizational skill. It was an era that would never come again, a moment when steam reigned supreme and the railroad represented the future itself.